Today's book is Thank You, Jeeves by Pj Woodhouse. So, depending on who you are, either you know who Jeeves and Woodhouse are or you don't. But because this is the internet and anybody could be watching, I'm just going to assume you don't and give background. You may not know. I didn't find out who Pj Woodhouse was until I think I was about 27 or something. And I've been reading a lot of Terry Pratchett books. And a friend recommended me to Woodhouse. He said, oh, if you like Pratchett, you should read Woodhouse, because Woodhouse was one of the authors that had influenced Pratchett. But, you know, like that's still kind of fairly, well, it's into adulthood. So I was not young at that point. Well, I mean, 27 is young, but you know what I mean. Whereas, I mean, the point being, he's not like Shakespeare or Dante or kind of one of those authors that everyone learns the name of in school. I think, especially if you're an American, you don't learn about Woodhouse in school. You kind of, depending on maybe what circles you run in, I think about your 20s is about right. You find out about him sometime in your 20s. I think he's much more popular in Britain. So if you're British, you've known about him for like forever. If you're an American, you may or may not know about him. Anyways, all of that is a long preamble just to kind of explain why I'm going to give some background on him, because Americans may or may not know who he is. So he was a British writer and a humorist, and if you look on Wikipedia, he had an incredible career. I think he published his first book in 1902, and his last book got published the year of his death in 1975. And I was looking at that, and I was like, okay, from 1902 to 1975, I thought, no, that can't be right. Surely those were the years that he lived and died, not like first book to the last book. But like, I guess the guy lived for a long time. He was born in 1880, published his first book at like 22 in 1902, lived till he was like 95 years old, and just continued writing books kind of all the way through. So he was incredibly prolific and incredibly long-lived and wrote for an incredibly long period of time. But he's best known for kind of writing in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. And then kind of, I think, his stuff kind of after World War II is not quite as famous. So he's kind of like, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, kind of that era in Britain. He wrote a lot, and he had a number of books and a number of characters, but his most famous character is Jeeves, kind of in the Thank You, Jeeves here. So Jeeves, if you're not familiar with it, and again I'm going to assume an audience that may not be, Jeeves and Wooster are the two characters. Wooster is kind of a young English aristocrat who's not terribly smart, a bit dim-witted, also a bit kind of impulsive and emotional. And Jeeves is his butler. And how to describe Jeeves? Jeeves, like if you're picturing a stereotypical English butler, like just the perfect stereotype, Jeeves is that perfect stereotype. Like he's just kind of very well educated, very smart, and extremely calm. Just like no matter what happens, he's like, very good, sir. Will that be all, sir? Anything else, sir? And he just never gets excited. Whereas Wooster is always getting excited. And the plot of these stories are, Wooster is always getting himself into trouble, and then Jeeves, who's the intelligent one of the two, is always kind of getting him out of trouble, or giving him advice as to how to get out of trouble. So I have known about these books for about kind of 10 years now, and they have kind of a classic place in the history of humor, or humor literature. Is that the term? So you know, they're classics. Like I think the first Jeeves story, Goes back to 1917. So, you know, they're quite old at this point as well. So I've been wanting to read them for a long time and haven't, largely because I didn't know where to start. So again, if you look this up on Wikipedia, Jeeves and Wooster do not get their own book until like kind of several years after their debut. They first kind of start off in a short story, which appears in a collection of short stories. I think there are 13 short stories and only one Jeeves story. So like if you wanted to start at the beginning, you'd have to kind of buy the whole book, read through all 13 stories, and only one of them is to do with Jeeves. Then I think the next book is half and half. It's kind of half Jeeves stories, kind of half other stories. And then I think the next book is kind of all Jeeves short stories. But like, I don't know, for the uninitiated, the problem of kind of where to start with these books, kind of you're like, well, geez, do I go for the first story or kind of the first book or what? And that is among other reasons why I've just kind of been waiting kind of 11 years from when a friend first recommended these stories to me to now when I first got around to it. But this came up at book club, and the other members of book club were all kind of in the same situation as me. They'd all kind of heard of Jeeves. They've all been wanting to read him, but nobody had kind of read him yet, and people didn't know where to start. And so we decided to just start with the first novel. So this is Thank You, Jeeves, is the first novel in the Jeeves series. So there are lots of short stories and there are several novels. This is the first of the several novels. And this was published in 1934. So Jeeves and Wooster as characters, Jeeves and Wooster and characters debuted in 1917. So they've been around for close to 20 years by this point, but this is their first novel. And so I suppose the first question is, for the uninitiated, if you wanted to just kind of jump in, how does this work as a good place to jump in? And the answer is fine. There is a continuity in this series, apparently. And right from the first chapter, you have Jeeves and Wooster, who are the main characters, but you also get kind of introduced to these other characters who Wooster knows. Sir Roderick Glossop, who apparently has been Wooster's antagonist for several stories at this point. And Wooster is kind of recounting how much he hates Glossop and kind of all the things that Glossop has done to him. And then there are numerous references back to kind of past adventures and kind of past events. Some of which Sir Roderick Glossop, apparently at one point Wooster was engaged to his daughter. There's something about kind of cats in the bedroom and shimmying down the fire escape, which was apparently from a previous Jeeves story, and that gets referenced kind of a few times. But if you don't care about kind of some of these references going past you, it's no problem. And I think this is kind of a universal experience, right? We've all had the experience at some time or another of jumping into a series in the middle for whatever reason. Like that was the only book you could find at the bookstore that day, or you didn't even know it was part of a larger series when you bought it, or whatever. And it's, you know, there are some references that you miss, but on the whole, it's never usually a problem. That wasn't a problem. If you're looking for a good place to start, you can start here. It's as good a place as any. Or I imagine, I mean, not having read them, but just I imagine, probably any book is good, huh? Yeah, you can probably just start anywhere in the series. Okay, so with that out of the way, how did I enjoy it? I loved it. It was a really funny book. It had me chuckling to myself a lot. There were some problematic political parts that I'll get to in a little bit, but like just as kind of a humor book, it was great. So I think as far as situational humor goes, just kind of setting up ridiculous situations, I'm not sure Pj Woodhouse is my favorite. Not to say he's bad, but other people do it better. But the dialogue in this book, the dialogue is just great. And Woodhouse gets a lot of mileage about kind of how excitable Wooster is and how calm Jeeves is. Jeeves will kind of understate everything. Wooster will, well, Wooster doesn't quite overstate everything. That's not quite right, because he is a member of the British aristocracy, and so they do kind of, understatement is like what the British do. So they're both prone to understatement, but Woodhouse Woodhouse is the author. Wooster can get himself very excited. Jeeves is always very calm, and then kind of the dialogue back and forth between the two is classic. It is also funny how dependent Wooster is on Jeeves. He is just utterly dependent on Jeeves, to the point that he needs Jeeves kind of around to complete his thoughts, or to kind of complete his quotations. There's a brilliant scene. It's right in the first chapter. Just, what is it? The second page? It's like 3 or 4 pages in. So, Sir Roderick Glossop comes, and he's chewing out Wooster, because Wooster has started playing the banjolele, and he's disturbing all his neighbors. And so Glossop says to him, "You're a public menace. For weeks it appears you've been making life a hell for all your neighbors with some hideous musical instrument. I see you have it with you now. How dare you play that thing in a respectable block of flats, infernal den." I remained cool and dignified. Oh, by the way, Wooster is the narrator for these. So when he says I, it's Wooster. He's first person as a narrator. I remained cool and dignified. Did you say infernal den? I did. Oh, well, let me tell you that the man that hath no music in himself. I stepped to the door. "Jeeves," I called down the passage. "What was it Shakespeare said the man who hadn't music in himself was fit for?" "Treason, stratagems, and spoils, sir." "Thank you, Jeeves. Is fit for treasons, stratagems, and spoils," I said, returning. So, like, that's just great. He's right in the middle of the argument, and then he needs to kind of check with Jeeves to finish off his quotation. And there's a bunch like this. There's another part. Where was it? Sorry, I should have marked these out before the video, huh? Wasting camera time. He's in love or something, and he says, it's another thing where he just can't get the right quote. He says, "Jeeves, what was it that chap thought of when looking at something?" What was it? He says, "Jeeves, what was it that somebody thought about something else when looking at something?" And Jeeves said, "Oh, I think you're referring to this quotation." Sorry, I just mangled that bit. It's funny in the book. Okay. I'm going to prepare my quotations in advance for the next video. So yeah, that's really funny. There's all sorts of like really great one-liners and kind of funny things in this book that just have you kind of chuckling throughout. Wooster has the worst luck for one thing, and then he has all these enemies for another thing. Like, he hates Sir Roderick Glossop. There's another girl whose father hates him, and then he has this. He really hates this young boy, Seabury. And to be fair, like, the boy is portrayed as being a bit of a brat, but Wooster just has this passionate hatred of the boy, which takes up way too much of his energy, to the point that he is eagerly awaiting any bad thing to happen to the boy. Let's see, can I find the quotation? So there are all these funny parts in the book, and I did not have the foresight to kind of footnote this book ahead of time. So you just take my word for it. It's funny. I really enjoyed it. I was laughing out loud at times. I think the plot of the book, I don't want to spoil too much, and really the plot is not kind of the main point in this book. These kind of books, there is a situation and then hijinks ensue. And they're just kind of antics and more antics, and Wooster just kind of goes from one disaster to another. The book kind of takes place, the story kind of takes place mostly over 2 days. And a substantial part of the action just happens in one night. And it's one of these nights where just kind of everything goes wrong for Wooster. Like he just cannot catch a break. He's trying to kind of get to a safe place and kind of get to sleep, and just everything that can go wrong does go wrong, and he ends up running from kind of place to place to place. And it's interesting. It's good for what it is, the kind of zaniness of it, with disaster kind of piling on disaster. It's also, I think, a little bit maybe tiring to read too much of in one sitting. I don't know. Experiences may vary for this. Taste may vary, so maybe you'll like it better than I did. I mean, I liked it, but I just felt like whenever I'm reading this type of book, I find it's best in small doses. I mean, like, okay, that's enough silliness for now. You know, it's getting a little... I can only handle, like, silliness, you know, I think because you get a kind of few good laughs out of it, and then you're like, okay, that's enough for now. Like, once you've gotten a few good laughs, I think it doesn't do to kind of read this in one long sitting. And there were a couple people in our book club. It was 4 people. 2 of them didn't even finish the book by the meeting day, which almost never happens to us. But I think that was kind of because maybe you kind of have to take this in small doses. I don't know. I finished everything on time. You'll be happy to know. So yeah, zaniness, plot, fun, small doses is good. I think I've talked around this long enough. It's time to get to the problem part of this book. So this book was published in 1934, and it is not politically correct. And I hate to harp on this, but you know, you can't, you can't recommend this book without saying these caveats. And I am going to recommend this book, which means I have to say these caveats. So, Woodhouse uses the N-word in this several times, and blackface plays a major part of the plot. I mean, it was a book written in 1934. I don't want to say too much more to that, partly because some of this is going to kind of give away the plot if I talk too much about it, and partly because, I don't know, what else do you need to say, huh? I don't think it's, insofar as you can judge a man with just one book, like I haven't read everything Woodhouse has written, I don't think he maliciously hates black people, so he's not like a vicious racist. I put kind of blackface in kind of maybe the insensitive and ignorant side of it. As for the N-word, I didn't realize this, but somebody brought this up in the book club. And you'll excuse me, I'm one of those people who thinks it's okay to use a word in a quotation. I'd never use it directed at somebody, or I'd never use it kind of myself. But I think when you're quoting something, it's just a little bit silly to say N-word as if like that made it any better. I think if you're going to quote it, you might as well quote it. So, pardon me on this one, but the book several times refers to nigger minstrels. And someone in the book club pointed out something that I didn't even know. They said that the nigger minstrels actually means white men in blackface. That was a term that the British people used to talk about white men in blackface. And it was specifically nigger minstrels because if you said colored minstrels, that referred to actual black people, whereas nigger minstrels referred to the blackface. So that kind of was a term for this in Britain at the time. I didn't even realize this when we were reading the book. I thought they were kind of black performers, and then white people kind of imitating them in blackface, which, without giving too much away, is a part of the plot. my friend said, no. There were no black people in this book. Even the nigger minstrels were white, because nigger minstrels was the term for white men in blackface in Britain at that time. And I thought, oh, right, okay. So, like, I guess it was his term. Although it is interesting, and I don't know how much to make of this. Like, everyone knows that nigger was less offensive back then than it is now. But was it perfectly okay in polite conversation? I don't know, but I don't think so. And it's interesting that Worcester says the term nigger minstrels, but Jeeves was always more refined, always says Negro minstrels. I've probably spent more time talking about that than that was worth. It's a caveat, if I'm going to recommend this book, that it's not politically correct. I don't think Woodhouse was insensitive. No, I think he was insensitive. I don't think he was malicious. I don't know. It's hard to tell just from one book, isn't it? You know, take that caveat into account. A couple more things. So, there's an interesting, if you're interested in this stuff, there's an interesting essay by George Orwell that you can look up online. It's called In Defense of Pj Woodhouse. Because it turns out that there was this whole controversy about Woodhouse, which, you know, like, I guess Americans don't even know this. But at the beginning of World War II, Woodhouse was living in Belgium or France or something like that. And for whatever reason, didn't even realize what was going on, didn't realize he was in danger, didn't think to evacuate, got captured by the Germans, got treated well, apparently, but ended up doing several radio broadcasts for them. And Orwell says in his essay that the broadcasts were non-political, that Woodhouse was just a humorist looking for an excuse to make jokes. Apparently it was in debate at the time how political the broadcasts were. It's an interesting little episode in history, and Orwell's got this whole essay about it. And Orwell says, look, the guy's just an idiot, he didn't know what he was doing. So it's a defense of him of sorts. But Orwell, in the course of that essay, says Pj Woodhouse, he's been writing about England, but he said his views on England have been frozen in time since 1914. So he says Worcester and Jeeves do not even exist anymore. He says Worcester, if he ever lived, would have been killed in 1915. So there is no Worcester today, and there are no Jeeves. And Orwell was writing this kind of in the 1940s. But Orwell was making the point that these characters were already an anachronism by the time they were kind of published. So, I don't know, an interesting little side note that Worcester and Jeeves, even though the book was published in 1934, apparently this kind of lifestyle was already an anachronism by then, the kind of British aristocrat at the country club type thing. I don't know, that's what Orwell says at any rate. There was, let me back up a moment. I was on to another note. I was reading something, Sherlock Holmes stories, a couple years ago, and I noticed there was this kind of xenophobia kind of throughout the Sherlock Holmes stories, where anyone who wasn't English was kind of a shady character. And this would include the French and the Germans and anyone with dark skin, the Spanish and the Italians. But it also included other kind of Anglo countries like Australia and America, where they were kind of looked upon as lands of lawlessness, and the American characters would always kind of assume they'd be able to bribe the cops, and Sherlock Holmes would be like, no, this is England. In this country, sir, we have laws. I mention that because there's kind of a very similar strain here going on, and thank you, Jeeves. I don't know, it must have just been common in British writing at the time to just assume the Americans didn't know about laws. Because there's an American character in this book who always just kind of assumes he can bribe his way out of trouble. And Jeeves is like, no, no, sir, in England there are laws. I know you Americans don't understand this, but... it's interesting though, Woodhouse was not hostile to the Americans. In fact, I think he married an American and he lived in America for several years. So he doesn't, by all reports, he quite liked America. But I don't know, maybe that was just kind of what they wrote in British books at that time. I don't want to spoil anything, but... Sorry, I'm changing subjects here. I don't want to spoil anything, but I love Tale of Two Cities, one of my favorite books by Charles Dickens, favorite books of all time. And there's a great line in here that references Tale of Two Cities. That's all I'll say. All I will say. You'll know it when you get to it. Anything else to talk about? I think maybe that might be it. It's a funny book. I would recommend it. Unfortunate about the racial politics of it, but the humor in the book is quite good. That's it.